well. Look, I can give you an example. So I know a bunch of people who run MBA programs, and I've had discussions with them because the thing about an MBA program is if it's selective, it's really hard to get in. It's like getting into Harvard. It's really hard to get into Harvard. You have to have an IQ that places you at least at the 99th percentile, and then you have to be really good at least one or two other things. So it's really hard to get in. Okay, so you think, well, why hire a Harvard graduate? Well, it's the quality of the education. It's like, no, it's not. It's the fact that it's really hard to get in. All of the value of the Ivy League education is in the screening before the education starts. Now, that doesn't mean that people go to Harvard and they get educated, but they'd get just as educated if they went somewhere else. First of all, it's like every university contains more information than any student can ever possibly process. If you're super smart, you can be dropped into a state college somewhere, a low-level state college. You just spend 4 years in the library. You know, like, what are you going to do, read the whole library? No. Right. So, and the data on this is quite clear. It's like, and it's the same with private schools. The reason that people who go to private schools do better than people who go to public schools is because, generally speaking, the people who go into private schools are smarter. It's not the education that's any better. And so we radically overestimate the degree to which training works. So now you can train people to be stupid, but training them to be smarter than they are is really, really, really hard. So, like I said, it's a dismal literature. And the liberals think everyone's roughly equal and there's a job for everyone, you just have to train them. It's like, no, wrong. And the conservatives think, well, there's a job for everyone if they just get off their ass and work. It's like, no, that's wrong too. Even though, if you work, that's better. And, well, so that's on the conservative end, but the liberals won't take into account individual differences. Well, obviously, that's part of what the whole politically correct discussion is about. It's like, everyone's the same. It's like, yeah, they're not. And I find it's really annoying, I would say. Like, I love to come to Silicon Valley. I've been here many, many times, and like, it's really something to come here and meet. There's so many people here who are off the scales intelligent, and they're all, clustered together, which is why this place is so unbelievably rich and so unbelievably productive, one of the reasons. But it's also very annoying that it's so left-leaning, because one of the things that the left-leaning Silicon Valley geniuses should understand is that they're the beneficiary of a genetic lottery. Mm-hmm. And they should take that seriously. It's like, yeah, you worked hard. Yes, you're entrepreneurial. Yes, you're on point. Put in your 60 hours a week. You do everything you could. But you have an IQ of 150. And like, that's not your doing. Mm-hmm. Right? That's something that happened to you. And so you can't be saying, well, it's all me. It's like, no, It's not. It's all you and the genius that you were granted as an infant. That's it. That's what's driving it. Now, that doesn't mean, I think, that people of disproportionate intelligence shouldn't be rewarded disproportionately. It's possible that they should, because it might be in the best interest of everyone else to dump as much money as possible to the top 2% of the cognitive strata, because they're going to be most generative with it. And even if it's not fair, because you might say, well, just because you won the genetic lottery, does that mean that you should have more money than anyone else? It's like, well, not on the grounds of fairness, but if you have to distribute money, well, who are you going to distribute it to? And I think, was it Ted, who ran CNN? Ted Turner. Mm-hmm. He estimated that if you tried as hard as you could in your entire life, there was no way that you could spend more than $400 million. And so let's say you have more money than that at your disposal. Well, hopefully you're going to do some halfway intelligent things with it, and hopefully you'd expect that the more intelligent people would do more than halfway intelligent things with it. So if you have to have unequal distribution, then a meritocracy is probably the best way to do it. But it still leaves you with this terrible problem, which is, what do you do with all the people who stack up at zero? And the answer isn't have contempt for them because they don't work as hard as you. It's like, yeah, a bunch of them don't. Because conscientiousness also predicts success. So among the poor, there are people who don't work, but you never want to underestimate the contribution of cognitive ability. So it's rough, man, and we don't take it seriously, and we don't know what to do about it. And it's clear that as inequality increases, societies destabilize. That's clear. So it's something that has to be dealt with, but we don't know how to deal with it. Don't know how to efficiently move resources to the bottom end of the competence hierarchy so that things don't destabilize. So, and I've worked with people, lots of people who are at the bottom end of the hierarchy in my clinical practice. And, like cocaine addicts, for example, low IQ cocaine addicts. Not all cocaine addicts have low IQ, by the way, but, it's just it's a triple whammy, let's say, because if you're a cocaine addict, you're probably also an alcoholic. And so if you're a cocaine addict and you're an alcoholic and you're sort of on the low end of the cognitive distribution, it's like you have a pretty damn rough life. There's a lot of things going wrong for you. And you're really lucky if you're flat broke. Because as soon as you get money, you are so done, you cannot believe it. So like when your unemployment check comes in and you're a cocaine addict, alcoholic who isn't employed, the probability that 3 days later you're going to end up face down in a ditch is really, really high. So don't be thinking like it's not so simple that you can just dump money down the competence hierarchy to the people who are in the underclass and expect that that's going to have a salutary effect. I don't think there's any evidence for that whatsoever. Like money is not an easy resource to use productively.
If they would have been, I bet you 10% better, we would not be in this situation right now. We would probably have Kamala Harris as the president-elect, because most people are willing to swallow a lot of shit. You know what I mean? Like we all have our own problems, all of our own stuff, but they went so in on all of the lies. The fact that Barack Obama 2 days before the election gave a speech, I think it was in Wisconsin, where he said that Donald Trump went to a white supremacist rally and said there were very fine people on both sides. The fact that he ran with that hoax again after it has been debunked
by people who wouldn't debunk it unless it was seriously not true.
I think the first time that got to mainstream media was me on Real Time, because James Carville brought it up with Maher, and I had never heard it said on mainstream, and I wasn't going to let him get away with it. And I said, what are you talking about? The next sentence out of his mouth was, but I'm not talking about the white supremacists and the neo-Nazis who should be condemned entirely. But Carville literally crumbles to the table because he did not know what to do when confronted with reality. And then Bill said, well, it was worded inarticulately or something to that effect. And I thought, well, that's an interesting way of playing a little bit of cleanup on that. But the point is, they thought, I think Obama, what would your psychological analysis of Obama be right there? It's 2 days before the election. He either believes it. Yeah. There's no way he could be that dumb and ignorant. Simply impossible. But maybe you want to give him 5% chance. You want to give him 5%? What do you want to give him on that? Let's give him 20%, right?
Yeah.
Okay, great, 20%. So he's unbelievably dumb and ignorant, and he ran the speech by nobody who's willing to confront him with reality. Or what would the only alternative be? He knows he can lie. It doesn't matter how big the lie is. And he thinks the lie will accomplish the goal, that the ends justify the means. I think they got to the end of that road. I think that's what this election was. You cannot tell us that there are very fine people on both sides. You can't tell us that Brett Kavanaugh is a serial rapist, or that the Covington kids are racist, or that Kyle Rittenhouse is a white supremacist. I mean, we could do a million versions. That 6 foot social distancing was scientifically backed. And I think that's actually what this election was about. It really, Trump then became the avatar that was sort of wrapped around that thing. And then Kamala basically became the avatar for the machine.
We talked too about the fact that in the last month, a lot of radical things happened around Trump the last month.
Oh yeah.
I mean, the fact that this weird coalition gathered around him, which is, completely preposterous. It's completely preposterous.
Yeah.
That Elon Musk is now going to be running the Department of Governmental Efficiency, and that has the same acronym as Doge.
Yeah,
that was a coin, and it's a funny dog, and it's do only good every day. It's like, what the hell is going on here? It's ridiculously comical that Musk is actually an X-Man, because that's the name of his platform, and that idea has been obsessing him for years, and that Gabbard is on board, and that Robert F. Kennedy came along, and that Vance is along, and so is Vivek Ramaswamy. I mean, these are very unlikely Republicans, very unlikely. And so that's weird as hell. And it's like, seriously, surreally, this is Pulp Fiction weird. It's
so what
really
do you think the unifying principle is? To me, it's that they love America. Like, that's sort of like you would say low resolution bumper sticker.
Yeah. I think it's analogous in some ways on the political side to what happened with the media, the new media that we were describing. There wasn't anything really that we had in common. Let's say you and I, or Weinstein, or Rogan, Shapiro, like that was a very diverse group of people.
It was free speech in the most, I guess, in the essence.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. It was, well, I think the thing we had in common, essentially, was our approach to discourse.
Yeah.
That was really all.
Yeah.
I mean, each of us taken in pairs had things in common, but it was devotion to discourse, open discourse, conversational discourse, essentially.
Yeah.
And in a sense, on agenda-free conversational discourse. I mean, one of the things that makes Rogan so perennially popular is that he's just trying to figure out what's going on. And that really is the case.
Yeah.
And Rogan, that what you see is what you get. He's all the people in that group are exactly the same on camera and off.
Yeah.
Exactly. There's no persona. They're just exactly who they are. And all of those people were and are iconoclastic, right? They didn't fit well in organizations. They all started their own thing. Mm-hmm. And that's really the same thing that's characteristic of these people that have gathered around Trump. And then, as we alluded to, we also have this other strange occurrence, which is the death throes of the legacy media. Douglas Murray, I talked to him the other day, and he said, well, don't throw all of the legacy media under the bus. There is the New York Post, for example. The Fox News people are trying to do their best. And,
sure.
You have the Free Press with Barry, but that's new media too. Mm-hmm. So by and large, the liberal end of the legacy media have doomed themselves to perdition because they got partisan and deceitful. Look, and they were also willingly blind because they didn't pay attention to the new media at all.
Well, nobody could be that bad at their job. No janitor could be so horrible at his job and still have a job the next day. Joe Scarborough lies every day. He sits in a chair at MSNBC at a giant corporation to lie. Somebody up there, I don't know who his boss is, but somebody up the chain of the corporation knows that he's lying about all of these things. They know that Joy Reid is in essence a neo-racist, or that Rachel Maddow spent 3 years relentlessly lying about vaccines and COVID. So what people, I think, have to understand is they're paid to lie.
Well,
they are well paid to push a particular narrative.
Part of the difference with the old media, let's say, the corporate media, and the new media is that those organizations are corporations, and the people that you see are the front men for the organization.
Exactly.
They're not investigative. They're not independent investigative journalists. Now, I know you claim that that you're not a journalist, and technically that's true, but that's the roughest equivalent because I don't know, apart from podcaster, I don't know what the definition is. So
yeah, I would. It's something like I'm trying to translate the nonsense, but that's not a
talk show host.
Yeah, I'm a talk show. I'm a talk show host. Yeah, whatever Phil Donahue was. That's what I am.
Well, that's right. That's right. Yeah. That's what I'm doing with my podcast too. They're talk shows.
But why is it then that for the last let's say starting when COVID started, like that day, all of the hoaxes that we've all been through, why is it that I didn't fall for any of them? Why is it that my track record, I get political predictions wrong all the time. I thought DeSantis could win the primary. I have no problem admitting that. I thought there was a different way the Republicans could go. And by the way, I'm thrilled with the result. I couldn't be happier. I fought for Trump and all that stuff. So putting aside political predictions, why is it that I didn't screw up why didn't I fall for all of the hoaxes? Why, when the Jussie Smollett thing came out and they said that two black guys, or that he was lynched by two guys with MAGA hats who said this is MAGA country, and it turned out to be these black brothers that he paid. Why is it that I didn't immediately fall for the hoax? Yeah, Kamala Harris immediately tweeted out that this proves we're a white supremacist nation, and I think that's still I think that tweet is still up. Why is it that MSNBC fell for every hoax? Why is it that I didn't fall for all of the COVID hoaxes? By day 15, I thought, okay, 2 weeks to stop the spread. We're done now. And now they've moved on to something else. It's not because I'm some kind of genius. Why did you not fall for all these hoaxes? Why did Rogan not really fall for all these hoaxes? And everyone, I'd say to some degree, we all got screwed up by COVID in some ways. And, I think you even said that you got, I think I did your first interview back after your health stuff, and you said that you got vaxxed, and you thought the whole idea was now the government, if I can quote you directly, was leave me the fuck alone.
Yeah. That's what I thought. I thought, okay.
And it's interesting. I remember thinking when you said that to me on air, I thought that's interesting because I never thought that.
Yeah.
I thought if I do it, they'll never leave me alone. And I think that actually turned out to be more true in some
definitely.
sense.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, well,
but what is it? What is it about us then?
Well, I think partly we put our finger on it with regard to the fact that you don't have a whole corporation behind you composed of people and advertisers that are all thinking the same thing and purveying the same message, right? So you can go out and scavenge for information. That's the other thing too, is the information environment that surrounds you. This is a point they made on MSNBC. I think it was the guy who runs Axios, who was the commentator. I think we're going to probably clip that into this show. He pointed out that, people who are on the cutting edge of the technological world, let's say the online media world, they're information scavengers. Like I gather information from, I'm on X a fair bit, but I gather information from a lot of different sources. It's not an easy thing to do. And so the information pipeline that you have isn't a legacy media monolith by any stretch of the imagination. And I think a lot of these people, the charitable interpretation is rather than being outright purveyors of falsehoods, they're in an ecosystem where it's like a monoculture. Everybody thinks the same thing.
Right. It's like a fish swimming in water that's so polluted, a tank that's so polluted that he can't see right in front of him, even though his memory's short anyway, but now he literally can't see where he's swimming. I mean, think about it. Why is it that I did a video in 2019, people can find it, saying Joe Biden has clearly the beginnings of dementia or something cognitively wrong with him. 2019. Again, I'm not a doctor. I was just watching the videos like everybody else. I watched the corn pop video.
But how much time do you spend every week looking at media information?
No, an awful lot.
Well, how much?
I mean, I would say I'm definitely within the X Twitter ecosystem a couple hours a day. So that's a pretty significant amount of time. I try not to do it on the weekends. I do my August off the grid thing, which I think also has helped me stay sane throughout this because I get out of the hamster wheel basically, once a year for 8 years now. But the Biden cognitive issue, they lied and lied and lied, and they kept saying, "Don't see what you see," and he's still president right now.
I know, it's unbelievable.
Although something seems to have turned on because I think he's starting to realize, man, he's got a legacy and he can figure it out in the next 2 months. And I think his legacy, if he's smart, and I don't know what's left of him, but if Jill and whoever else is around him that has sense with them, they have an incredible opportunity right now, and I hope they'll take this. The opportunity is you have no reason to placate to the left. You were brought in because you were old Joe the moderate. You weren't crazy Bernie. You weren't Elizabeth Warren. You weren't one of the radicals. You governed like one of them. They took advantage of you. But now they clearly tried to screw you by forcing him out. He's basically said that. I mean, that's what he said on The View, that they forced him out. He thought he was going to win. So we'll find out what happened there one day because eventually the truth will come out. But what an interesting moment he has right now. He has 2 months to say, I have no reason to play with you children anymore, and I can build a legacy. So what could my legacy be? Well, maybe Donald Trump's not Hitler. And maybe I could do a few things like, I don't know, maybe somehow winding down some portion of the Iraq war or helping Israel win their war, getting our hostages back, the American hostages, if not the Israelis, or maybe doing something about the border, which they are doing a little more now. He has an interesting moment right now where his legacy could be, he took us to the precipice of hell. He got taken advantage of, right? They'll write about it one day. But then right there, when he had a moment, the 2 months between administrations, he did something right. And I don't think that's complete. A lot of people are saying I'm nuts for that. But if you were Joe Biden, and again, we don't know what's really in his mind or what he's capable of cognitively at this point. But wouldn't that be a pretty good ending to the story?
Carl Jung talked about this phenomenon he described as retrogressive restoration of the persona. It's a complicated idea, but basically what it means is that sometimes you take a leap forward and you learn some things, but you can't catalyze a new identity, so you try to go back and hide in your old identity. And that actually doesn't work because, well, things have changed and you've learned something and that isn't who you are anymore. And so it's like you have to cut parts of yourself off in a destructive manner to fit back into the person that you were. Now what happens here is that Pinocchio escapes from this tyrannical situation and undergoes this descent into chaos, but he tries to go back home. He tries to go back to what he was. And he can't do that anymore. His father isn't at home anymore. And so when he goes home, he finds that there's no home there. Now, this happens to people sometimes, and it's often a shock to them. So they'll often stay under the thumb of their father. And you think, well, why would someone do that? Because it means they're subject to the tyrannical judgment of their father. They're always concerned about what their father would think or whether their father approves of them, and so forth. And you think, well, that's got to be an unpleasant place to be. Why would you do that? Freud said, for example, that no one could be a man unless his father had died. And Jung said, yes, but that death can take place symbolically. Okay, so there's that part of the idea. And then another part of the idea is, one of the times in your life when you actually realize that you're an individual is when you'll go and ask your parents something and you'll realize they actually don't know any more about what you should do than you do. And that sucks. And that's partly why people are often willing to maintain a tyrant-slave relationship with their father. It's like, on the one hand, you have to be inferior in a relationship like that. You know, you've always got the judge watching you. But on the other hand, there's always someone who knows what to do. There's always someone standing between you and the unknown that you can go ask, what should I do? Well, at some point, you'll realize that the reason you can't ask that anymore is because they actually don't know any more than you do. And then that's a pain. Like that is a symbolic death. And that's also when you establish a more individual relationship with your parents. It's at that point that you could conceivably start taking care of them instead of the reverse. And that's a time that should come. But you have to let that image of perfection go. And that exposes you. Well, that's what happens here. You know, Pinocchio goes home and he wants things to be the way they were, and he wants to stay under the careful care of the benevolent father, but that's no longer possible. He's past that point, and that's why the father has disappeared. And so Geppetto has gone off to look for Pinocchio because he also needs his son, but in any case, the house is abandoned. And so then we see inside the house that everything's covered with cobwebs and everything's gone, and Pinocchio and the cricket sit on the steps and they're very concerned. First of all, they wonder where he went, so they're actually concerned that he's gone, but they also don't know what to do because there's just no going home. And so, you know, that's also the case that once you hit a certain point in your development, well, it's the same thing we already talked about. The answers that you're looking for are not going to be found in your parents' house. It's as simple as that. Now, you could artificially maintain your dependency, but, you know, if you do that for too long, things get pretty ugly.
And the Lord said unto Abram, and this is the opening of the story, get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. And this is one of those phrases where every clause is significant. Go somewhere you don't understand. That's the first thing. Get thee out of thy country. You know, back in the 1920s, there was a whole slew of American writers who ended up as expatriates in Paris, Hemingway among them, and a variety of others. It was very inexpensive in Paris at the time, and part of their transformation into great literary figures was the fact that they were out of their country, and now they could see what their country was, because you can't see what your country is until you leave it. So you have to go into the unknown, and that's God's first command. Go into the unknown, because you already know what you know. And that's not enough unless you think you're enough. And if you're not enough and you don't think you're enough, then you have to go where you haven't been. And so that's the first commandment to Abraham. It's like, okay, that's a good one. That makes perfect sense. Go to where you don't know. Yes. And from thy kindred. Well, what does that mean? It means grow up, right? That's what it means. It means get away from your family enough so that you can establish your independence. And that isn't because there's something wrong with your family, although perhaps there is, you know, as there is perhaps wrong with you. But it means get away. You know, I talk to people very frequently whose families have provided them with too much protection. And they know it themselves. And that means they're deprived of necessity. You know, one of the things that you see in the United States, for example, is that the children of first-generation immigrants often do better than their children. And the reason for that is that the children of first-generation immigrants have necessity driving them. And you don't know how much you need necessity to drive you, because maybe you're not very disciplined. And if a catastrophe doesn't immediately befall you if you don't act forthrightly today, then maybe you never act forthrightly, right? Because the gap between your foolishness and the punishment is lengthened by your unearned wealth. And so you never grow up and learn, and you have to get yourself away from your dependency in order to allow necessity to drive you forward. And that's to become independent and to become mature. And I think part of what's happening in our culture is that the force that's attacking the forthright movement forward of young men in particular is afraid of the power of men, because it's confused about the distinction between power and authority and competence. Like a man who has authority and competence has power as a byproduct, but the authority and competence is everything. And people who can't understand that fail to make the distinction between power and authority and competence, and they're afraid of power, and so they destroy authority and competence. And that's a terrible thing, because we need authority and competence. What else is going to allow us to prevail in the long run? And so you get away from your country, and you get away from your kin and from your father's house, right? And you go out there and you establish yourself in the world. It's a call to adventure. That's what the first lines in the Abrahamic story is, a call to adventure. Peter Pan is this magical boy. Pan is the god of everything, roughly speaking, right? And so it's not an accident that he has the name Pan. And he's the boy that won't grow up. And he's magical. Well, that's because children are magical. They can be anything. They're nothing but potential. And Peter Pan doesn't want to give that up. Why? Well, he's got some adults around him, but the main adult is Captain Hook. Well, who the hell wants to grow up to be Captain Hook? First of all, you've got a hook. Second, you're a tyrant. And third, you're chased by the dragon of chaos with the clock in its stomach, right? The crocodile. It's already got a piece of you. Well, that's what happens when you get older. Time has already got a piece of you. And eventually, it's got a taste for you. And eventually, it's going to eat you. And so Hook is so traumatized by that he can't help but be a tyrant. And then Peter Pan looks at traumatized Hook and says, well, no, I'm not sacrificing my childhood for that. So that's fine, except he ends up king of the Lost Boys. In Neverland, well, Neverland doesn't exist, and who the hell wants to be king of the Lost Boys? And he also sacrifices the possibility that he'll have a real relationship with a woman, because that's Wendy, right? And she's kind of conservative, middle-class, London-dwelling girl. She wants to grow up and have kids and have a life. She accepts her mortality. She accepts her maturity. Peter Pan has to content himself with Tinkerbell. She doesn't even exist. She's like the fairy of porn. She doesn't exist. She's the substitute for the real thing. And so, but the dichotomy that you're talking about is very tricky, because there's a sacrificial element in maturation, right? You have to sacrifice the pluripotentiality of childhood for the actuality of a frame. And the question is, well, why would you do that? Well, one reason is it happens to you whether you do it or not. You can either choose your damn limitation, or you can let it take you unaware when you're 30, or even worse, when you're 40. And then that is not a happy day. I see people like this, and I think it's more and more common in our culture, because people can put off maturity without suffering an immediate penalty. But all that happens is the penalty accrues, and then when it finally hits, it just wallops you. Because when you're 25, you can be an idiot. It's no problem. Even when you're out in a job search, it's like, well, you don't have any experience and you're kind of clueless. It's, yeah, you're young. It's no problem. That's what young people are like, but they're full of potential. Okay, well, now you're the same person at 30. It's like people aren't so thrilled about you at that point. It's like, what the hell have you been doing for the last 10 years? Well, I'm just as clueless as I was when I was 22. It's, yeah, but you're not 22. You're an old infant, right? And that's an ugly thing, an old infant. So part of the reason you choose your damn sacrifice, because the sacrifice is inevitable, but at least you get to choose it. And then there's something that's even more complex than that in some sense, is that the problem with being a child is that all you are is potential, and it's really low resolution. You could be anything, but you're not anything. So then you go and you adopt an apprenticeship, roughly speaking, And then you become something. And when you're something, that makes the world open up to you again. You know, like if you're a really good plumber, then you end up being far more than a plumber, right? You end up being a good employer. Not that plumbers, I'm not putting plumbers down. It's like more power to plumbers. They've saved more lives than doctors. So, hygiene, right? So, you know, if you're a really good plumber, well, then you have some employees, you run a business, you train some other people, you enlarge their lives, you're kind of a pillar of the community, you have your family. Once you pass through that narrow training period, which narrows you and constricts you and develops you at the same time, then you can come out the other end with a bunch of new possibility at hand.
One of the things that I've realized is that people that are self-reflective, that rely on cerebral horsepower, that pay attention, that think in a detailed way, the more nuanced that your thinking is, the fewer people are going to be like you, which makes you feel more alone. How do you think people can overcome this?
Well, I would say that hasn't been my experience exactly. Because as I started to make my thoughts more public, they seem to appeal to more and more people. And so I don't know if that's a threshold phenomena, because maybe it is, you know. As you start to become specialized as a scientist, in some sense your vision narrows and narrows, although it gets more high resolution at the level that you're operating. But you kind of pass through a needle, let's say, out the other side where the thing you're studying starts to become everything again. And so maybe that's that developmental progression.
Further, more.
Yeah, specialization and then
generalization again. Yeah, I think that you might be right there. The deeper into the breach thing, the show that I went to go and see you do in Manchester in 2017 or 18, someone asked a question about the depth of my consciousness causes me to suffer, and you said you take more of the thing that poisons you until you turn it into a tonic that girdles the world around you. And I think that this is something you see here as well, that when you start to think differently, when you start to consider the way that you're living your life in a more detailed, higher resolution, more unique, more nuanced way, you will probably receive pushback, especially, you know, speaking from personal experience, in the normal working class towns, people born, live, die in these places, it's insular. There isn't a huge culture of, especially in the UK, tall poppy syndrome is a huge problem. The biggest difference that I've noticed actually between American people and English people is that American children are told that they can be anything that they want to be. They're told that they have blue sky vision, they can achieve whatever they want. And that gives them a lot of confidence. When us Brits, stuffy, stiff upper lip Brits see Americans on TV, it sounds like everyone's had media training. Because everybody's just so enthused about whatever it is, even if it's a 18-car pileup. And then the equivalent in the UK is that deviating from the norm is very, very, very quickly mocked. And
there's a lot of that in Canada too.
Tall poppy syndrome, it's a big deal. Now,
the Japanese have that saying too, except it's the nail that sticks up above all the rest is the first one to be struck down by the hammer. And there's some truth in that too. There's some truth in that, but some and all are very different words.
When you roll the clock forward, what you end up with is American children that then become adults who look around at the world and say, well, hang on, this wasn't what I was promised. I was told that I could be anything that I wanted to be. I was told that I could have anything that I wanted to have.
There's a difference between you can earn everything that is earnable and you deserve everything there is. So that message can become what you say, it can become misinterpreted in a narcissistic manner. And I think that has happened to some degree, especially as people have had fewer and fewer children. You know, Jonathan Haidt and Luke Yanoff talk about the coddling of the American mind, and they think about that in large part as a consequence of an ideological transformation. And some of that's true, but it's also useful to look at more fundamental phenomena. People have children when they're a lot older. They have way fewer children they have way more resources when they have children on average. You know, if you're one kid of 8, you're pretty much battling it out for attention, for a very finite amount of parental attention with a lot of intense competition. And the probability that you're going to come out of that entitled and narcissistic is pretty damn low, because your siblings will definitely punish you for that. But if you're the only child, especially of older parents who are also more conservative because of their age and also less willing to take chances with you because there's only one of you, and then you have a lot of resources at your disposal, well, that's a whole different developmental milieu. And we have no idea what the consequences of that are. But the idea that children in that circumstance are more likely to be overprotected and dependent and structured, it's like, well, yeah, undoubtedly. And, you know, that would even be an overabundance of parental virtue in some sense, right? Well, we just did nothing but pay attention to our child. Okay, but too much.
What did you expect?
Yeah.
It's so strange because I'm an only child, right? And all of the, well, maybe my friends might say differently, but a lot of the commonly held presumptions around only children, and I have a couple of friends who are as well, and I don't know whether it's where we're from, that the northeast of the UK is very spit and sawdust, it's salt of the earth people, it's, you know, grab your bootstraps and your boots and start pulling. And I just haven't seen that. What is it through your clinical practice?
This might not be a primarily working class phenomena, you know, the coddled mind phenomena. That could easily be a middle class and upper phenomena.
Is there something, was there a common trend, or from your reading, have you found that only children tend to be one way or another?
No.
So you just get huge variance in them as well?
I don't know the answer to that at the level of individual psychological data. There might be a literature. I'm not aware of it. That, for me, that was more a response to Haidt's book on the coddled mind. I thought, okay, fair enough. Coddling of the American mind. What's driving this? It's not just ideas. It's a huge demographic switch. It's a huge transformation in the way we raise children. We're 10 years older when we have our children now. That's a lot older. You know, when you're 18 and you have a kid, you're still a kid. And that there's some wildness that's perhaps not so good about that. But there's also perhaps a higher proclivity to go off and live your own life. And then, you know, how much should your children be left on their own? The answer is as much as they can tolerate. And how much is that? Well, you find out with each child. But it's certainly possible to not deprive your child enough.
What's happening, people? If you enjoyed that, then press here for the full, unedited episode. And don't forget to subscribe. Peace.
If you're feeling resentful about something, there's a shadow that reveals itself in two ways. One is it's a pointer to your immaturity. You need to be more disciplined. You have set goals, hypothetically, and if you haven't, then you're under the sway of someone else, or you're undisciplined and unintegrated and incoherent, which is all shadow life in some sense. You're pursuing short-term impulsive goals because you haven't thought it through. You're pursuing goals that other people have established for you. You're not pursuing any goals at all because you're too nihilistic to believe that life has any purpose. All that's shadowy, let's say. But maybe you have set goals and now you're resentful about all the work that you have to do in order to acquire those goals. And maybe that manifests itself as a broad-scale critique of social structure. That's immaturity. And so you can delve into that and you can find out where you're still a spoiled child and hopefully take action to rectify that. Or you may find that you're being compelled to do something that violates your integrity and you need to stand up for yourself and say something that you don't want to say. And then you may have to learn how to incorporate your anger into your actions so that you learn how to say no when you need to say no. And so that actually means that you're furthering your ethical pursuit as a consequence of integrating your shadow rather than deviating from it. aggression, which can be repressed, sexuality, lust, let's say, which can be repressed. Those things are extremely useful servants when they're integrated into the whole. If you're without aggression and anger and incapable of it, that doesn't mean that you're on a good path and that anger knocks you off it. That can happen, but it's much more appropriate and sophisticated to note that the probability that you're going to pursue a higher good is magnified by your integration of all your emotional and motivational states, even the ones that can cause a tremendous amount of trouble when they're left to manifest themselves in isolation. You're way too agreeable. Well, I would say you could practice saying what you really believe, that you can take a vow to tell the truth. And that will make you much less agreeable. Agreeable people are perfectly willing to sacrifice what they know to be the case to maintain short-term social harmony. And it's not so much that they repress what they think, it's often that they don't even allow themselves to fully realize what they think. So commitment to the truth can make an agreeable person, will stop an agreeable person from being a doormat. I kind of outline the reasons why people become deceitful, arrogant, and resentful. And we have our reasons. It's in some sense, it's a miracle that it doesn't happen all the time. And so I say, well, here's the problem. You know, death chases you, you're mortal, and illness will be a part of your life and a part of the lives of people you love. And it will be terrible, maybe beyond your imagining. You're stuck with that, man. And culture, there's a tyrannical aspect. It crushes you and turns you into a cog and maybe destroys the best in you to some degree. You're stuck with that. And then you, Christ, you're just a massive contradictions and trouble. You can't get yourself organized. You're doing all sorts of things you don't want to do and not doing the things you know you should do. And, putting obstacles in your path just so you can trip over them. Well, there's the landscape. Well, why would you turn to the dark side, let's say, in the face of that? It's like, no wonder, obviously. But it doesn't help. It seems to make everything worse. So, and it doesn't seem, if you're objecting to the fact that things are bad, it doesn't seem that making them worse is a tenable solution. It's an attractive solution at times because people think deeply, oh, to hell with this, it's so awful that I'll just add to the misery out of spite. And man, if you don't see the compulsion of that argument, either you're not, I don't know, maybe you're fortunate. You're sheltered. Maybe you're saint-like. That would be good. But it and you see this in clinical practice all the time. Voluntary confrontation with what is threatening and unknown tends to be curative. And not always. There are mistakes people make. So for example, you often see these trauma teams rush in to talk to people just after, say, a mass shooting or some kind of terrorist attack. And it does not help people to have them review the trauma that they're currently experiencing. Not unless it's problem solving oriented, it can just make it worse. But if it's an old memory, well, then voluntary recall and explicit reformulation seems to be useful. Or at least it's better than anything else we know. His proposition was that every ideal is a judge. And that makes perfect sense because an ideal is something to which you aspire. And the gap between you and that ideal, if it's your ideal, is felt as judgment. And so that's one of the reasons people are very afraid to have an ideal, to make it. That's why I wrote, do not hide things in the fog. It's like, well, you should lay out an ideal. You should pursue an ideal. Why wouldn't you? Well, when you make your ideal explicit, it turns into your judge. well, then you can listen to that judge and move forward and transform. But, it's pretty damn harsh. Because especially to begin with, you posit an ideal, especially if you're in a mess. God, every bit of you is being judged as unworthy. Everyone looks at the costs of making a decision, but almost no one looks at the costs of not making the decision. And the reason for that is you're sitting there right now and the sky isn't falling on you. And so you're not calculating the costs of sitting there because nothing's happening. And then if you decided to do something different, you might calculate the costs of doing that, but you've already zeroed out the costs of inertia. But they aren't zero. There's no zero cost. There's risk here and there's risk here. And you don't like that idea because you want security, and no bloody wonder. It's no wonder you want security. But when you're making a decision, you need to reawaken the costs of inertia. I mean, those are opportunity costs, let's say, something like that. There are ways they are formally considered, but just going along as you are when everything is changing around you is also a costly decision. And so if you know that, you think, well, there's danger here and there's danger here, then that, weirdly enough, that frees you up, because then you can pick the danger that you prefer. Now, the price you pay is the realization that there's no security down either road. And you have to wake up to that now and then in your life. It's very unpleasant. It's not surprising people don't do it. But again, the costs of failing to do it are worse. Do not do what you hate. And what does it mean? Well, it doesn't mean, geez, I hate getting up at 8 o'clock in the morning to get ready for work. That just means that you're not very disciplined, or maybe that it might mean something deeper. But I'd start with lack of discipline before, rearranging your whole life. Because you might say, well, I hate getting up at 8 o'clock in the morning no matter what I'm doing, and then it's not your job. I don't mean don't do difficult things. I mean, watch yourself, and if you see that you're doing things that make you hate yourself, then consider the cost of continuing. Just notice, because you're reporting to yourself, just like you just said. In some sense, that wasn't a voluntary decision. You noticed that you couldn't breathe unless you discussed this issue. It's like, well, why is that? You don't know. You can't control it even. I mean, you can not do it and pay the consequences, but you can't say to yourself easily, well, that's stupid. I should be able to breathe. Just because I haven't said this thing, that shouldn't stop me from breathing. But there it is. And wise people that I've read, often associated with the establishment of the Christian church, actually, this seems to be something that was a continual topic of discussion, noted continually that we do things that we can't control, and we're subject to forces that we can't control. And those are forces that are associated with our own destiny, I suppose, certainly our own conscience. You just have to watch. You find out who you are. I'm the person who has to say this. Why? I don't know exactly. But I know that if I don't do it, there's going to be a price.
And I would think about this, because I'll tell you what it is that you need to do to be successful. Some of these things aren't so malleable, but others are things that you can work on. Well, IQ, well, that's a rough one, because there's no evidence, as far as I can tell, that you can do a damn thing about your IQ. I was just reading a paper by Dan Simon today. It's a relatively recent review. Dan Simon did the invisible gorilla stuff, and he was looking, because there's all these companies that claim that these online brain training exercises can produce cognitive improvements, and he reviewed the literature again. And I've reviewed that literature like 6 times in the last 15 years, because I keep hoping that someone will crack the problem, but it's always the same answer. It's like, you do brain training games, you get better at the game, a lot better at that game. You get slightly better at similar games, but distal games that are still heavily cognitively loaded doesn't affect your performance at all. Zero, none. So the issue of how to raise IQ, man, that's a killer. No one knows how to do it. I can tell you how to stop your IQ from decreasing as you get older. That's not so bad, because it does that. Fluid IQ decreases from the time you're 20 and pretty rapidly. It's physical health is the best preventative. So exercise, physical exercise. Weirdly enough, you think, well, why? Well, your brain uses oxygen like mad, right? And it needs to be kept clean and well oxygenated. And physical exercise, both like weightlifting, so anaerobic and aerobic exercise both seem to be very, very effective at staving off cognitive declines across the lifespan. So that's a really useful thing to know, because that's the only thing we know that does that. So then the next best predictor of lifetime success is conscientiousness. Well, so, and of the two aspects of conscientiousness, say orderliness and industriousness, the better predictor is industriousness. So the question is, well, what can you do about your industriousness? And the answer to that is, well, that's kind of rough too, because there's a strong genetic component. But you can work on micro habits with regards to your conscientiousness. And I think the best micro habits, this is partly to do with this future authoring program processes, I think the best thing you can do with regards to your conscientiousness is to set up some aims for yourself, goals that you actually value. And the future authoring program helps people do that. And basically, it does a situational analysis it helps you do a situational analysis of your life more than a psychological analysis, I would say. And so the questions are something like, well, all right, you're going to have to put some effort into your life. And you need to be motivated to do that. And so what are the potential sources of motivation? Well, you could think about them in the big five manner. If you're extroverted, you want friends. If you're agreeable, you want an intimate relationship. If you're disagreeable, you want to win competitions. If you're open, you want to engage in creative activity. If you're high in neuroticism, you want security. Okay, so those are all sources of potential motivation that you could draw on, that you could tailor to your own, your own personality. But then there are dimensions that you want to consider your life across. And so we ask people about, well, if you could have your life the way you wanted it in 3 to 5 years, if you were taking care of yourself properly, what would you want from your friendships? What would you want from your intimate relationship? How would you like to structure your family? What do you want for your career? Well, how are you going to use your time outside of your job? And how are you going to regulate your mental and physical health? Maybe also your drug and alcohol use, because that's a good place to auger down, because alcoholism, for example, wipes out, 5 to 10% of people. So you want to keep that under control. And then so maybe you develop a vision of what you would like your life to be, and that associates the goal. Once the goal is established, and then you break down the goal into micro processes that you can implement. The micro processes become rewarding in proportion, in relation to their causal association with the goal, and that tangles in your incentive reward system. We talked about the dopaminergic incentive reward system, and that's the thing that keeps you moving forward. And the way it works is that it works better if it produces positive emotion when it can see you moving towards a valued goal. Okay, well, what's the implication of that? Better have a valued goal, because otherwise you can't get any positive motivation working out. And so the more valuable the goal, in principle, the more the micro processes associated with that goal start to take on a positive charge. And so what that means is, well, you get up in the morning and you're excited about the day, you're ready to go. And so as far as I can tell, what you do is you specify your long-term ideal. Maybe you also specify a place you want to stay the hell away from, so that you're terrified to fail as well as excited about succeeding, because that's also useful. You specify your goal. You do that in some sense as a unique individual. You want to specify goals that make you say, oh, if that could happen as a consequence of my efforts, it would clearly be worthwhile. Because the question always is, why do something? Because doing nothing is easy. You just sit there and you don't do anything. That's real easy. The question is, why would you ever do anything? And the answer to that has to be because you've determined by some means that it's worthwhile. And then the next question might be, well, where should you look for worthwhile things? And one would be, well, you could consult your own temperament. And the other would be, well, you kind of look at what it is that people accrue that's valuable across the lifespan. So you do a structural analysis of the subcomponents of human existence, and I already did that. You need a family, you need friends. Like, you don't need to have all these things, but you better have most of them. Family, friends, career, educational goals, plans for, time outside of work, attention to your mental and physical health, etc. You know, that's what life is about. And if you don't have any of those things, well, then all you've got left is misery and suffering. So that's a bad deal for you. So once you set up that goal structure, let's say, and that's really in many ways that's what you should be doing at university. That's exactly what you should be doing, is trying to figure out who it is that you're trying to be, right? And you aim at that, and then you use everything you learn as a means of building that person that you want to be. And I really mean want to be. I don't mean should be, even those things are going to overlap. And it's important to distinguish between those, because that's partly, and this is back down to the micro routine analysis. So if I was saying, well, you're going to try to make yourself more industrious. Okay, number one, specify your damn goals, because how are you going to hit something if you don't know what it is? That isn't going to happen. And often people won't specify their goals too, because they don't like to specify conditions for failure. So if you keep yourself all vague and foggy, which is real easy, because that's just a matter of not doing as well, then you don't know when you fail. And people might say, well, I really don't want to know when I fail, because that's painful. So I'll keep myself blind about when I fail. That's fine, except you'll fail all the time then. You just won't know it until you've failed so badly that you're done. And that can easily happen by the time you're 40. So I would recommend that you don't let that happen. So that's willful blindness, right? You could have known, but you chose not to. Okay, so once you get your goal structure set up, you think, okay, if I could have this life, it looks like that might be worth living, despite the fact that it's going to be, anxiety provoking and threatening, and there's going to be some suffering and loss involved in all of that. Obviously, the goal is to have a vision for your life such that, all things considered, that justifies your effort. Okay, so then what do? Well, then you turn down to the micro routines. It's like, okay, well, this is what I'm aiming for. How does that instantiate itself day to day, week to week, month to month? And that's where something like a schedule can be unbelievably useful. Google Calendar. It's like, make a damn schedule and stick to it. Okay, so what's the rule with the schedule? It's not a bloody prison. That's the first thing that people do wrong. They say, well, I don't like to follow a schedule. Well, it's like, well, what kind of schedule are you setting up? Well, I have to do this, then I have to do this, then I have to do this, and then I just go play video games, because who wants to do all these things that I have to do? It's like, wrong. Set the damn schedule up so that you have the day you want. That's the trick. It's like, okay, I've got tomorrow. If I was going to set it up so it was the best possible day I could have, practically speaking, what would it look like? Well, then you schedule that. And obviously, there's a bit of responsibility that's going to go along with that, because if you have any sense, one of the things that you're going to insist upon is that at the end of the day, you're not in worse shape than you were than at the beginning of the day, right? Because that's a stupid day. If you have a bunch of those in a row, you just dig yourself a hole and then you bury yourself in it. It's like, sorry, that's just not a good strategy. It's a bad strategy. So maybe 20% of your day has to be responsibility and obligation, or maybe it's more than that, depending on how far behind you are. But even that, you can ask yourself, okay, well, I've got these responsibilities. I have to schedule the damn things in. What's the right ratio of responsibility to reward? And you can ask yourself that, just like you'd negotiate with someone who is working for you. It's like, okay, you got to work tomorrow. Okay, so I want you to work tomorrow. And you might say, okay, well, what are you going to do for me that makes it likely that I'll work for you? Well, you could ask yourself that, So maybe you do an hour of responsibility and then you play a video game for 15 minutes. I don't know, whatever turns your crank, man. But, you have to negotiate with yourself and not tyrannize yourself. Like you're negotiating with someone that you care for, that you would like to be productive and have a good life. And that's how you make the schedule. It's like, and then you look at the day and you think, well, if I had that day, that'd be good. Great. And you're useless and horrible, so you'll probably only hit it with about 70% accuracy, but that beats the hell out of 0, right? And if you hit it even with 50% accuracy, another rule is, well, aim for 51% the next week, or 50.5% for God's sake, or because you're going to hit that position where things start to loop back positively and spiral you upward. And so that's one way that you can work on your conscientiousness, is plan a life you'd like to have. And you do that partly by referring to social norms. That's more or less rescuing your father from the belly of the whale. But the other way you do that is by having a little conversation with yourself about,
as if you don't really know who you are, because you know what you're like. You won't do what you're told. You won't do what you tell yourself to do. You must have noticed that. It's like you're a bad employee and a worse boss, and both of those work, for you. You don't know what you want to do, and then when you tell yourself what to do, you don't do it anyways. You should fire yourself and find someone else to be. But